Time to disassemble the shutter and lens assembly and get this stripped for cleaning. So we'll start here. Front lens group just unscrews with your fingers, it shouldn't be too tight. There's probably a dress ring underneath that just covers the front of the shutter surround there and the inside. It doesn't have any role in setting the distance of the lens from the shutter. That's all taken care of. The lens screws back hard against this internal face here. So if that ring's missing, don't lose any sleep over it. At the back, we're going to remove the rear group. Again, it'll only be finger tight, or should be. Some of them are tighter than others. We have the retaining ring, which I'd put back on there after I'd removed the shutter from the camera body so we didn't lose it. And a spacer or shim that's used to set the distance of the lens and shutter assembly from the film plane to account for any tolerances in the focal length of the lens. Right, we'll start at the back. 2 screws at the back. Small countersunk head screw here. It's very short. This washer has an integral screw has an integral washer. That's used to locate the shutter housing on the front of the focus mount to stop it rotating. Now I've pulled the outer casing away from the inner casing there. Don't pull it any further than that. You've got to disconnect the flash wire. There's a single black screw here. And I can unhook that wire. There it is there. There's our curved cocking rack, and this piece does the detents for the aperture settings. These little grooves in here are tracked by a little knob on the inside of this lever, so you can feel them click into place. That can come off. Now that screw I loosened to loosen up my flash wire. Don't remove it completely at this stage. There's a small insulator in there that we need to be careful not to lose. To the front of the shutter. This front plate is locked. It's bayoneted onto the front of the shutter, and it's locked with a little screw here. I'll see if I can get a... We'll rotate that. It's got a flat side on it. So I'll rotate it to take the flats to the centre. Then I can turn that ring and lift it off over the cutouts. You can see it's got 3 little raised pieces there that bayonet in, and there are 3 notches here. Right, so the front ring can come off. This is the shutter speed cam or shutter speed setting ring, and it sets the shutter speeds, and the cam for the shutter speeds runs over various things there, and there are other functions too. Disconnect this little spring here. That's the latch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. The main drive mechanism is driven by a spring which needs to be unhooked from its post there, and we can lift the main drive ring off the shutter. Right, disassembly from this point starts with the B lever. This piece is the B lever. Its job is to lock the shutter in the open position when the leaves are fully open, when the shutter is set to B and the shutter release button is being held down. It's held down with a single screw with a spring wrapped around it. they normally travel together. There's our B lever. You can lift out the shutter release arm there. This section is the flash sync mechanism. It's got a strong drive spring here. I'll just unhook that. There's our spring. Pop that to one side. 2 screws hold this in. One holds the XM setting lever at that end. The other one is a plain screw at the other end. Undo those, lift them out. Be careful not to lose this spring, which is busily trying to get lost. This spring here, which should be hooked over the other side of that post, that's a bit better. That keeps our X and M setting lever in one or either of its positions. This piece can be lifted off. We have 2 spacers in here, one at each end. They space off that top cover to keep it at a constant height from the body. This little latch needs to come out. Now this is 2 pieces, and I'll show you how you put those back together another time. It's in one piece at the moment, but they're only held together by a spring and fall apart very easily. Our flash stuff here, here's our flash contact. It's held by a single screw here. This is the moving contact. And can be lifted out of the body. This is 2 pieces. The arm, which operates the contact and the contact itself, and there's a countersunk head screw there. Here's a cam that closes the contact when it's set to the M setting. There's the pull from the little gear set. There's a pull wheel there that runs on, and that serves part of the timing mechanism for the M setting. And this spring is for the highest speed of the shutter, the 500th. It's only brought into bear when you set the 500th. That flash sync mechanism has 2 settings, X and M. X is for electronic flash. Electronic flash, the contacts are made at the point where the blades reach their maximum opening, and that's because at that point electronic flashes open they fire very quickly. They're almost instantaneous in their firing. Bulb flashes take time to warm up. It's not a very large time, but it's certainly measurable. And in order to make sure that the bulb had time to reach its maximum intensity before the exposure was made, the bulb was actually ignited before the shutter fired to give it time to warm up. And that's why we have the 2 different settings. I can remove this flash. Oh no, this is where we have to get that screw out on the outside that we'd loosened to get the wire off. It's a very small screw. It's about 1mm by 1mm. There's a plastic slug in here, an insulator, so that the screw doesn't bear directly on the wire. It just presses the wire against the contact inside here. And we have to be careful not to lose that insulator because it's much smaller than that screw, and they're a bugger to replicate when they've disappeared, and you have to make a new one. So we remove that single screw, and if we're lucky, this fixed contact will lift out of the body. No, we're not. So we've got to loosen these 3 screws holding the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. And then if we give it a bit of a wriggle, that will free up that plastic post that carries the fixed flash contact, and we should be able to lift it out of the body. 1, 2, and there's the third one. I knew there was another screw there somewhere. Right, turn that over carefully. See if that'll lift out now with a bit of a wriggle. No, it doesn't. I'll just give that a little very gentle push out. It's plastic, it's a styrene type plastic. It's very delicate, easily cracked, and never ever gets solvent anywhere near it. Not even Ronsonol, that'll eat it too. Okay, so we have that out. We have our screws out. We should be able to lift this outer case off the mechanism plate now, and we can. There's our two major components. We have a mechanism plate carrying the shutter blades and the mechanisms that work the shutter blades. The other part of it is the case, and the case contains the diaphragm and the mechanism for opening and closing the diaphragm. And we'll start with the case. So if you turn it round part of the way, you'll see that you can see two screw heads through these cutouts. They are the screws that hold this aperture settings lever to the componentry inside. So we can undo those screws. And the setting lever falls away. We'll put that to one side. And if we give that a shake up the other way, our screws will come out. And here we have the case. So there are 3 screws hold this cover plate in place. One of them is a countersunk head screw, and there's a countersink in the plate where it fits. 2 of them are plain screws. You don't want to mix them up. I'll toss those into that container. And we can turn this lot out. Okay, so what have we got here? We've got the case. This piece here with the slots in it, that connects up to that aperture settings ring, and the aperture settings ring rotates to either left or right, and as it does so, the pins on the diaphragm plates, which are in these slots, mean that the blade is either swung to the open position or to the closed position. Here is the cover plate. This has the fixed positions that the pins on the other end of the diaphragm blades fit into, so that they pivot around these points. That all needs to be cleaned. And here we have the diaphragm blades themselves. They look a little bit oily, they're not particularly bad, but they're certainly not clean. Now the diaphragm blades are not symmetrical. The pin at one end is right near the edge of the blade. The pin at the other end on the opposite side is closer to the centre. And it's important that they go back in the correct place. The pin on the edge, to the outside edge, that works in these slots. The pin that's closer to the centre, that runs in these fixed holes in that cover plate. And now this componentry needs to be cleaned up so that we can reassemble it. Right, and start cleaning these blades. And I'm using cigarette lighter fluid and cotton bud. You be very gentle with these blades. If you're rough and you catch them on the swab while you're trying to clean them, you can put a bend in the blade. And if you put a bend in the blade, they won't run smoothly, and the diaphragm will be harder to adjust than it should be. So as I clean them, I line them up at the top of my piece of paper, ready to put back in. And the way I've got them set here is the way they're going to go back into the fixed plate. They're cleaning very well. The marks are all coming off them, which tells me that it probably was oil, and that the blades themselves are in good condition. When there is oil on these blades, it tends to stick them together, and it sort of sucks them together. They stick very well, to such an extent that when you're trying to work the diaphragm, there's a lot of friction there, and the blades, although you'd think that oil would be lubricating things and protecting them from the friction, you can actually end up with more friction. And the edges of the blades, being relatively sharp because they're relatively thin, will scratch on the underlying blade or the overlying blade, and you end up with permanent marks or scuff marks. Sometimes the finish, because these have a finish to them, it's a blued looking finish, and I don't know how it's comprised, but that can actually be scuffed through where one blade has been riding over another. These blades are in quite good condition. I have to keep changing to a new cotton swab so that I'm not transferring filth from one blade to the next. If the blades were very badly marked, that's pretty much just bad luck with diaphragm blades. With shutter blades, where they show a lot of staining and marks, because they do not have any rivets on them, you can polish them successfully with a bit of Brasso and leave the blades looking like new. But the diaphragm blades, because they have the rivet at each end, it's much too easy to catch on that when you're trying to polish the blade and end up bending the blade. So it's just not even worth the risk. When I worked at Kodak many years ago, it was normal practice, if there were marks on the diaphragm blades, to polish them out with metal polish, with Brasso. But I can remember it was a constant feature of the day when you were attempting to do that would be trotting down to the spare parts drawers at the other end of the workshop and getting a new blade. Of course, there is no big spare parts department at the end of the workshop here, and there are certainly no new blades. So discretion is the better part of valour, as they say. Shutter blades, because they need to move at high speed, they need to be very low in friction, and so polishing them is certainly an advantage if they show any sort of imperfections, minor surface corrosion or something of that nature. Aperture blades, by comparison, diaphragm blades here, they don't have to move at high speed. They only move at the speed that you're turning from one aperture setting to the next. So a little bit of friction is neither here nor there. You just need to avoid heavy friction from oil on the blades, which sticks them together and causes you an immense amount of grief if you then force the setting. Right, let's drag you back into the picture and clean these other components. So we have the fixed plate or the cover plate. One side of this goes towards the diaphragm blades and in the assembled shutter. The other side goes against the shutter blades. So both sides of this plate need to be clean and oil free. And the cotton bud's coming away stained here, so you can tell I'm picking up some dirt from the surfaces. That's good. You may be able to see this plate depending on how the light catches it. There are fingerprints on there. Now they're actually etched into the surface. What it means is that someone has held that between their fingers and the perspiration and skin oils have just etched into that coating on the metal. So things of this nature, handle them by the edges if you handle them at all. Those marks don't come out. And finally the case. And the case needs to be cleaned inside and out, but especially inside. I'm cleaning the threads for the rear lens group and the thread for the retaining ring on the outside at the back. Now I'm cleaning the inside of the case. Again, I'm just using Ronsonol, cigarette lighter fluid and a cotton bud, and I'm removing all traces of old grease, dirt, oil, anything that's annoying. You can see the colour of that coming off there, that's always dirty. With aluminium, whatever you use to clean, it's always going to come off a little bit grey because it'll be picking up aluminium and aluminium oxides presumably. I'm just cleaning right around that top rim of that case, all around the inside, make sure that's all clean. The case doesn't come in contact with the diaphragm blades because they run in between the two rings here really. Alright, well that's ready for a reassembly. And so I'll need to reassemble that on my jig, and the jig, let's turn this around. I'll check, I'll just reset my camera here I think. Okay, now I'll just start reassembly. Now the fixed plate needs to go up the correct way. It's got recesses on one side where the shutter blades end up sitting. That goes down on the jig here. Right, I've got my tweezers. I've got a couple of pairs here actually, and I've got a toothpick to help me manipulate things into the correct position. And since I've swapped my piece of paper around, my blades are all pointing the wrong way, so I've got to move them individually. And the blades go in so that their pivot, which is the rivet closest to the centre of the end of the blade, not the one closest to the edge, drops into the positions on this plate. Now, if these blades were, something's not sitting right here, something's fallen out of position already. It's my jig not sitting flat. Let me get this down into place. That's better. Something's not sitting flat here. I'm going to have to investigate what's going on. Oh, something is not right. That's better. If these blades get damaged, they get buckled up, they won't sit flat. If they won't sit flat, it's very hard to get them to lie properly on top of each other. One end will keep wanting to pop up, and because one end keeps wanting to pop up, it'll be disturbing the blade that you're trying to lie down on top of it in the next position. So that's another reason you have to be very careful with cleaning them, because if they get distorted, they are very, very hard to reassemble. And these blades have obviously got a little bit more distortion on them than I originally thought, even though they weren't very oily. It probably means that at a previous time they were quite oily, and whoever serviced them last time and removed all that oil would have had the joy of reassembling this too, while it was difficult. So when we get round to here, the blades are overlapping. We have to get the blade in under the existing blade onto that plate. So we have to pull them back further and further away as we get there. And we have to do this without pulling any of the existing blades out of the holes that they've been carefully placed in. And it does tend to get more and more awkward as you go around. And here I'm just have to manipulate these blades so that they slide back smoothly. We're down to the last couple of blades. One more position. Now I've got to check carefully to make sure that I did in fact put those blades in the right way round. But we're not done yet, so I've plenty of time for that. Alright, so the blades are all in place. Now I've got to lift back over these blades without disturbing anything. That looks okay. Now this actuating ring needs to go on next, and there are 3 holes in this plate at the edge. 1, 2, 3. 2 of them are quite close together. They're the ones we're interested in here. And this plate, I know from experience, when the diaphragm is open, its maximum aperture, it sits there just beyond that hole. Now I've got to move this about till I can get all my pins sitting in those slots correctly. It should just drop into place. That's all correct, and now the case can go over it. The case has a number of holes in it, but the holes we're interested in are this one, and this one, which align with those 3 holes on that fixed plate there. So I can lower that into position very carefully. That feels like it. I felt that drop into place. I'm lifting off the outer part of my jig, placing it underneath, and I've got to align these holes in the fixed plate with the holes in the shutter case. At the same time, I'm watching to make sure that the pins for the diaphragm are sitting in that fixed plate and correctly. There were 3 screws that went in here. 2 of them were plain. 1 of them was a countersunk head screw. And the countersunk head screw has to go into the countersunk hole, which is there. So I'll just run that screw lightly down. Take one of the other screws, make sure that hole's aligned. This other part of the jig just serves here to help apply some light downward pressure to that fixed plate to stop it bouncing out of position while I'm busy trying to get my screws in, which is exceedingly helpful because getting all those little rivet pins in their correct positions on the fixed plate and the moving plate is a bit fraught. Okay, so let's see if the diaphragm works correctly. As I move this ring backwards and forwards, the blades swing in and out evenly and smoothly. Now I can go back and tighten those 3 screws because I know my blades are all seated correctly. We'll put the aperture setting ring back in place. So I'll move this ring around until it lines up with the holes in the plate here. Now, our aperture setting ring, I don't think we gave that a wipe, so I'm going to give that a wipe with a bit of solvent now too. Just to remove any oil and dirt. That's good. And this goes on here. It could go on one of two ways, but the way it needs to go on is with the aperture pointer here on the opposite side of the case from these cutouts. So we just align the hole here with our screw hole here and drop one of our two screws in there. I've just done that up lightly. I need to get its mate installed on the other side here. Why is that sticking to my tweezers? Must have a bit of glue on there. That's it. It swings smoothly. Right, I'm going to do those screws up, and to do that screw up snug, I'm just going to support on the edge of the wooden block against that ring there so that I'm not pressing on anything. Just snug that screw up. You don't need to go mad, and do the same on the other side. They're easily stripped out, don't overdo it. If you do strip them out, you're going to have to rivet them over instead, so turn them from a screw into a rivet. That's tedious. You don't want to be doing it lightly, because it makes it very, very difficult for the next poor person that comes along and wants to service the shutter. Alright, so there's our diaphragm. It's working smoothly. I wouldn't say it's an awful lot difference in feel from what it was like before we started. But it's certainly clean. We can be happy that there are no contaminants on those blades and that it's likely to stay working in exactly that fashion for some length of time. Now we can deal with our mechanism plate and the shutter blades.